Okay, so we're going to talk about some of the different groups of non-vascular plants, also known as the bryophytes. So those terms sometimes get changed around. So the thing about the non-vascular plants that is kind of a general character we'll see is that, and this is kind of a key character really, is that the haploid gametophytes are the dominant stage of the life cycle. It's the larger, more conspicuous plant you see. Whereas the diploid sporophyte is small, relatively short-lived. It might have some photosynthetic capability or maybe not, but either way, it's so small, it's actually nutritionally dependent on the gametophyte. So we're going to see that throughout all our non-vascular plants. We're also going to see a lack of true roots, true stems, and true leaves. And we'll see that instead of roots, they're going to be anchored by something called rhizoids, which are sort of these long tubular single cells that just kind of help anchor them to the substrate. Okay, so let's start looking at some of these groups, some of these phyla within our non-vascular plants, starting with phylum Hepatophyta. Which sometimes get called the liverworts. There are about 9,000 species. So most have elevated gametophytes that resemble like little miniature trees. Here is an example of some of those elevated gametophytes that look like kind of like little trees. The sporophytes are very, very small. You probably wouldn't even notice them. Some are what we would call thalloid, and some are what we would call leafy. So this, and let me actually get my pointer out. So this would be an example of a thalloid liverwort. And this would be an example of a leafy liverwort. It looks like it's got little leaves, so it's just kind of based on their structure. So these little tree-like structures, of course, are, in this case, these are the female ones that are bearing the archegonia, which are the female gametophalangia. So this is where we would find the eggs. So this structure is involved in sexual reproduction. But we can also get some asexual reproduction. So these little things are called gemme cups. They look like little suction cups to me. And inside here are little tiny plant propagules, little teeny tiny plants that when they get dislodged by a raindrop are capable of developing into a fully mature individual. So they kind of package themselves that way so they can disperse and reproduce asexually. So that's kind of a cool thing that we see going on in this phylum. So the phylum Bryophyta are our mosses. This is probably the one you're the most familiar with. This is also the largest phylum, 15,000 species. So the sporophyte is going to grow up from a female gametophyte. And what I mean by that is illustrated in this image here. So there's the female gametophyte, and here's the sporophyte, the stalk with that sporangium on the top. And so remember, these are the embryophytes. So when this plant was developing, it stayed within the maternal tissues, and then it just grew right up out of it. So that's what I mean by that. The Bryophyta have stomata for gas exchange. They have a sort of simple transport tissue that helps move around water. They have sort of specialized cells called hydroids. And they just transport water a little better. It's not quite the same. It's not the same as having vascular tissue. It's nowhere near as advanced as that. One kind of neat thing we see ecologically going on with the moss is a type of moss called peat moss forms these dense mats that kind of decompose in water and form kind of this compressed mass that we call peat, which can actually be cut up and used as a fuel source. We also use it. It's also got some applications in horticulture. It's often added to soils and things like that. If continually compressed, it actually can become coal. And when it decomposes in water, it creates this anaerobic environment that can actually really well preserve things because it protects them from oxygen. So this person that you see here is a perfectly preserved well, I don't know if specimen is the right word, but I believe that this dates back to the 13th century and just kind of illustrates how perfectly preserved this person was. Apparently fell into a peat bog, and because of the very low oxygen content, the tissues didn't really decompose. I mean, you can even see the hat, you can even see a little bit of the hair. It's really quite extraordinary. So this is the moss life cycle. Kind of got off topic there talking about the peat man. So the moss life cycle is a really good illustration of what a non-vascular plant alternation of generation looks like. So let's start by just thinking about moss itself. Okay, so what you would think of as moss. That seems like a reasonable place to start. So what you would think of as moss, that leafy kind of green mat, that is actually the gametophyte you're seeing. Because the gametophyte is the dominant generation, the more conspicuous generation. So this is our this is our moss gametophyte. Now if we were to zoom in onto the tips of these gametophytes, we would find the gametangia, the male and the female gametangia. The male gametangia, remember, are called antheridia, and they produce the sperm. The female gametangia are called archegonia. They produce the egg. Now, water is really important to allow this life cycle to happen. A drop of water will disrupt the sperm in this antheridia, and these sperm have flagella, and they need water in order to swim to the egg in the archegonia. The egg does not leave the archegonia. It does not leave the tissues of this archegonium. So once sperm and egg meet and fertilization happens, within this archegonium is the diploid sporophyte that starts to develop. So here we have a developing embryo that is diploid, and it stays within the haploid structure of the female gametophyte and grows out of it. So here's our sporophyte, just this stalk and this capsule. That is it. That is the sporophyte generation, the diploid generation. At the top is the sporangium, and inside this sporangium, specialized cells will undergo meiosis to create spores. Those spores are then haploid, right? Because meiosis took a diploid cell and made it haploid. Those spores can then germinate, and this structure here, this sort of immature gametophyte, we call it a protonema. Okay, so that's a term you should know, that protonema. I'm going to actually even underline that. Protonema. Divides by mitosis and becomes larger and larger and eventually becomes our mature gametophyte. And then the cycle completes again. And again, the big thing that's different than the fern life cycle I showed you before was that the gametophyte is the dominant generation here. All right, phylum Anthocerophyta, the hornworts. They get their name because their sporophyte is kind of this sort of structure that kind of looks like a horn, and that is what the name hornwort is referring to. So the cells, each cell contains a single large plate-like chloroplast, instead of having like lots of small chloroplasts. They often form symbiotic relationships with nitrogen fixing bacteria, which makes them really excellent colonizers, right? Because they can obtain nitrogen because of this symbiotic relationship. So they're really good at starting out on a blank canvas and still doing pretty well. And that, I'm not going over a lot of the details. In lab, we'll look a little bit more at this phylum and some of the internal structures of this phylum Anthocerophyta. Some groups I'm giving a little more attention than others, simply because we can't cover every single group in a high level of detail. We just would run out of time. Okay, so that ends it for our that ends it for our non-vascular plants. I'm going to end this video here so that I can start a fresh new video talking about seedless vascular plants. So, see you in a few.